The coffee pot was heavy in Sarah Mitchell's hand as she made her way between the red vinyl booths of Eddie's diner. It was 7:30 on a Thursday morning in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small that everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, refilling cups without being asked, remembering who took cream and who took it black. Her uniform was simple, a pale blue dress with a white apron, sensible shoes, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Nothing fancy. Nothing that drew attention, and that's exactly how she wanted it. "More coffee, sweetie?" she asked old Mr. Henderson, who sat in his usual spot by the window. He grunted and pushed his cup forward without looking up from his newspaper. Sarah filled it halfway, just how he liked it, and moved on. At the counter, 3 men in their 30s sat laughing too loud, their voices cutting through the morning calm. They were construction workers from 2 towns over, brought in for a new housing development on the edge of Millbrook. They'd been coming in for about a week now, and Sarah had learned to avoid them when possible, but avoiding them wasn't always an option. "Hey, honey," one of them called out, snapping his fingers in her direction. "Coffee, now." Sarah took a breath and walked over, pot in hand. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and began to pour. "You know," the man said, leaning back on his stool, "for a waitress, you're not very friendly." His buddies laughed. "I'm friendly enough," Sarah said evenly, finishing the pour. "Nah, I don't think so," another one chimed in. He was bigger, with a thick neck and a smirk that made Sarah's jaw tighten. "You walk around here like you're too good for this place. Like you're better than us." Sarah said nothing. She'd heard worse. Much worse. "Maybe she thinks she's tough," the third one said, grinning. "Look at her. Bet she couldn't handle a real job. Probably never worked a hard day in her life." The first man laughed and nudged his friend. "Yeah, carrying coffee pots all day. Real tough work." Sarah set the pot down on the counter with a soft clink. She met the man's eyes for just a second, long enough for him to see something flicker there, something cold and distant, but then she looked away. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked. "Just a smile, sweetheart," the big one said. "Is that too much to ask?" She didn't smile. She walked away. Behind her, their laughter followed like a shadow. In the kitchen, Eddie was flipping pancakes on the griddle. He was 67, with kind eyes and a bald head that shone under the fluorescent lights. He'd owned the diner for 30 years, and he'd hired Sarah 6 months ago when she'd walked in looking for work. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. "You okay out there?" Eddie asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Fine," Sarah said, setting the coffee pot down on the warmer. "Those guys giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." Eddie studied her for a moment, then nodded. He'd learned not to push. Sarah was the best employee he'd ever had. Showed up on time, never complained, worked harder than anyone else, but she kept to herself. There was a wall around her, and Eddie respected it. "Let me know if they get out of line," he said. Sarah nodded and grabbed 2 plates of eggs and bacon, balancing them expertly as she pushed back through the swinging door. The diner was filling up now. The morning regulars were trickling in. Retirees, a few high school teachers, a couple of moms with toddlers in tow. Sarah moved between them like a ghost, efficient and invisible. But the construction workers weren't done. "Hey, Sarah," the big one called out as she passed. He'd read her name tag. "That's a nice name. You got a boyfriend, Sarah?" She ignored him. "I'm talking to you," he said, louder now. Sarah stopped. She turned slowly, her face calm, her eyes flat. "No," she said. "I don't." "Well, maybe you need one," he said, grinning. "Someone to teach you some manners." His friends howled with laughter. One of the regulars, Mrs. Calloway, a retired schoolteacher, frowned and shook her head. But no one said anything. That's how it was in small towns. You minded your business. Sarah walked away again. Inside, something was coiling tight in her chest. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger was hot and quick. This was colder, quieter. It was the feeling she used to get before a mission, when everything slowed down and sharpened into focus. But those days were over. She'd left that life behind 2 years ago, after her last deployment ended in a way that still haunted her sleep. She'd been a sergeant in the Army, part of a military police unit attached to special operations. She'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, trained in hand-to-hand combat, weapons, tactical response. She'd been good at it. Too good, maybe. But after what happened in Kandahar, after the ambush, after the firefight, after the choices she had to make, she couldn't do it anymore. So she'd come home to Millbrook, the town where she'd grown up. She'd taken the first quiet job she could find. She'd tried to disappear, and for 6 months, it had worked. Until today. At 8:15, the bell above the diner door jingled, and 2 men walked in. Sarah glanced up from wiping down a table and felt her stomach drop. They were young, mid-20s maybe, and they moved wrong. Too tense, too aware. One was thin and jittery, his eyes darting around the room. The other was stocky, with a hard face and a bulge under his jacket that Sarah recognized immediately. A gun. She'd seen 1,000 men like them, in checkpoints, in raids, in the split second before everything went to hell. The 2 men sat down in a booth near the back, and the jittery one kept looking toward the door. The stocky one stared straight ahead, his hand resting on his lap. Sarah's pulse kicked up, but her face didn't change. She walked over with menus, moving slow and easy. "Morning," she said. "Coffee?" The jittery one nodded too fast. The stocky one didn't respond. Sarah poured 2 cups and stepped back. "I'll give you a minute to look over the menu." As she walked away, she heard the jittery one whisper, "How much longer?" "Shut up," the stocky one hissed. Sarah's mind was racing now. She glanced at the clock. 8:17. She scanned the diner. 12 customers. Eddie in the kitchen. 1 exit in the front, 1 in the back. She moved behind the counter and set the coffee pot down, her hand steady. Then the stocky man stood up. He reached under his jacket, and everything changed. The gun came out fast, a black semi-automatic pistol that caught the morning light as the stocky man raised it above his head. "Everybody stay calm," he shouted. The diner went silent. A fork clattered onto a plate. Somewhere, a child started to cry. Sarah's body reacted before her mind could catch up. Every muscle remembered, every nerve fired. 2 years of trying to forget, and it all came roaring back in an instant. She stayed perfectly still behind the counter, her hands visible, her breathing controlled. The jittery one jumped up from the booth, pulling out a gun of his own, smaller, a revolver, and his hands were shaking so badly Sarah wondered if he'd ever held one before. "Phones on the tables. Now!" the stocky one barked. "Wallets, purses, jewelry, everything. Do it now and nobody gets hurt." The construction workers at the counter froze. The big one who'd been mocking Sarah just minutes ago had gone pale, his mouth hanging open. Mrs. Calloway let out a small gasp and fumbled for her purse. The jittery gunman moved between the tables, his revolver sweeping back and forth. "Come on, move, I said move." People started pulling out their phones with trembling hands, setting them down on the tables. Wallets came out. A woman unclasped her necklace. Sarah assessed the situation in seconds. 2 armed men. The stocky one was in control. He'd done this before, or at least thought he had. The jittery one was dangerous because he was scared, and scared people made mistakes. 12 civilians. No cover. Eddie was still in the kitchen. She could hear the griddle sizzling, which meant he didn't know what was happening yet. The front door was 20 feet away, too far, too exposed. Sarah's military training whispered in her ear, "Wait. Observe. Don't engage unless necessary." But her heart was pounding against her ribs, and her hands, hidden below the counter, had curled into fists. The stocky gunman turned toward the counter, his eyes landing on Sarah. "You, waitress, empty the register." Sarah met his eyes. Flat. Cold. Emotionless. She'd seen men like him before. Desperate. Angry. Looking for an easy score. "Okay," she said quietly. She moved slowly to the register, every motion deliberate. She hit the button, and the drawer popped open with a ding. "Faster!" the jittery one yelled from across the room. He was standing near the booth where the construction workers sat, and his gun hand was shaking worse now. Sarah began pulling bills from the register, setting them on the counter. 1s, 5s, 20s, maybe $300 total. It wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. The stocky gunman stepped closer, his gun now pointed directly at Sarah's chest. That all? That's all, Sarah said. His eyes narrowed. There's gotta be more. Check the back. There's nothing in the back. Don't lie to me. He slammed his free hand on the counter and several customers flinched. Sarah didn't. She just looked at him. Calm. Still. And something in her gaze must have unsettled him because he took a half step back. What are you looking at? He snapped. Nothing, Sarah said. For a moment the diner was frozen, a snapshot of fear and tension, the only sound the crying child and the low hum of the refrigerator. Then the jittery one made his mistake. He grabbed the construction worker, the big one who'd mocked Sarah, and yanked him up from his stool. You, what's in your wallet? The construction worker's face was slick with sweat. I don't. Give it to me. But the construction worker's hands were shaking too badly. He dropped his wallet, and it hit the floor with a slap. The jittery gunman lost it. Pick it up. Pick it up now. I'm trying. The jittery one swung the revolver, hitting the construction worker across the side of the head. The man crumpled to his knees, blood trickling from his temple. Stop! Mrs. Calloway cried out. And that's when Sarah knew it was about to get worse. The jittery gunman spun toward Mrs. Calloway, his revolver swinging wild. Shut up, or I'll— Calm down, the stocky one barked at his partner. Just calm down. But the jittery one wasn't listening. His eyes were too wide, his breathing too fast. He was spiraling, losing control. Sarah's mind clicked into combat mode. She'd seen this before. Soldiers cracking under pressure, insurgents hyped up on adrenaline and fear. It always ended the same way. Violence. She had maybe 10 seconds before someone got shot. Her eyes flicked to the stocky gunman. He was still focused on the cash, stuffing bills into his jacket pocket. His gun was lowered, not aimed, just held. The jittery one had his back partially turned, his attention on Mrs. Calloway. 10 seconds. Sarah's hand slid below the counter. There was a shelf there. Coffee supplies, napkins, a roll of quarters Eddie kept for change. And a knife. Not a kitchen knife. A tactical folding knife Sarah had carried since her army days, hidden in her apron pocket every shift. Old habits. Her fingers closed around it. 8 seconds. The jittery gunman was yelling now, waving his revolver at the customers. I said, shut up, all of you, shut up or I start shooting. The stocky one looked up, alarm crossing his face. Hey man, relax. Don't tell me to relax. 6 seconds. Sarah's thumb flicked open the blade. 3 inches of carbon steel. She kept it low, hidden against her thigh. 4 seconds. The jittery gunman turned back toward the counter, his revolver sweeping across the room, and his eyes met Sarah's. For just a heartbeat, they stared at each other. He saw something in her face, something that didn't belong in a small-town waitress, something hard, trained, dangerous. His eyes widened. 2 seconds. He started to raise his gun toward her, and Sarah moved. She exploded from behind the counter, closing the distance in 3 strides. Her left hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, twisting it up and away with brutal efficiency. Her right hand came up, the knife flashing. But she didn't stab him. Instead, she slammed her palm into his elbow, hyperextending the joint. He screamed. The revolver fell from his hand. 1 second. Sarah spun him around, wrenched his arm behind his back and drove him face first into the nearest table. His head hit the surface with a crack and he went limp. The revolver clattered across the floor. Total time elapsed. 4 seconds. The diner was dead silent. Every eye was on Sarah. The stocky gunman stood frozen, his mouth open, his gun still lowered. Then he snapped back to reality and raised his weapon. Don't move, he shouted, his voice cracking. Don't you? But Sarah was already moving. She kicked the fallen revolver toward the construction workers, then grabbed the coffee pot from the nearest table. The stocky gunman fired. The shot was deafening in the small space. The bullet punched through the window behind Sarah, glass exploding outward. But Sarah had already dropped into a crouch and the shot went high. She hurled the coffee pot. It spun through the air, hot coffee spraying in an arc, and hit the stocky gunman square in the face. He screamed, staggering backward, his hands flying up to his scalded skin. His gun dipped. Sarah closed the distance. She grabbed his gun hand with both of hers, twisted the barrel away from the civilians, and drove her knee into his groin. He doubled over with a choked gasp. She stripped the gun from his hand, ejected the magazine, and racked the slide to clear the chamber. The live round tumbled through the air. Then she dropped the gun and swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard. Sarah planted her knee on his back, grabbed his arm, and twisted it into a control hold she'd used 100 times on suspects in Kandahar. He groaned, his face pressed against the linoleum. Sarah looked up. 12 faces stared back at her in stunned silence. The construction workers, Mrs. Calloway, the young mothers, old Mr. Henderson, and Eddie, standing in the kitchen doorway with a spatula in his hand and his mouth hanging open. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Sarah's chest was heaving, adrenaline screaming through her veins, but her hands were steady. "Someone call 911, she said quietly. It took 6 minutes for the first police cruiser to arrive. 6 minutes of Sarah kneeling on the stocky gunman's back, her knee pressed between his shoulder blades, his arm locked in a hold that would break bones if he moved wrong. The jittery one was still unconscious, slumped over the table where she'd put him down. Nobody in the diner spoke. They just stared. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, confused, frightened, fascinated. She'd gone from invisible waitress to something else entirely, and they didn't know what to make of it. The construction worker she'd kicked the revolver toward had picked it up with shaking hands and now held it pointed vaguely at the floor, like he was afraid it might bite him. Blood still trickled down his temple from where the jittery gunman had pistol whipped him. "You can put that down," Sarah said quietly, not looking at him. "It's over." He set it on the counter like it was made of glass. Eddie finally moved, stepping out of the kitchen doorway. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse. How did you—" "Not now, Eddie." He fell silent. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The stocky gunman groaned beneath Sarah's knee. "You're breaking my arm," he wheezed. "I'm not," Sarah said flatly. "But I can if you keep talking." He went quiet. Mrs. Calloway stood up slowly, her hands clutched to her chest. "Young lady," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved us. You saved all of us." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the front door, watching for the police. The construction workers were whispering to each other now. The big one, the one who'd mocked her, who'd called her weak, who'd said she couldn't handle a real job, looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Who the hell is she?" One of them muttered, "I don't know, man. I don't know." 2 police cruisers screeched to a stop outside, lights flashing red and blue across the diner's windows. 4 officers came through the door fast, hands on their weapons. "Police! Nobody move!" Sarah raised her left hand slowly, keeping her right knee on the gunman's back. "Suspect subdued," she called out, her voice calm and clear. "Second suspect unconscious at the table. 2 weapons secured. Semi-automatic pistol on the floor near the counter, revolver on the counter. No injuries to civilians except minor head wound on the man at the counter. The lead officer, a man in his 40s with gray at his temples, stopped and stared at her. "Who are you?" he asked. "Sarah Mitchell. I work here." He looked from her to the gunman beneath her knee, then to the unconscious one at the table, then back to Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let us take over." Sarah nodded. She released the hold, stood smoothly, and stepped away with her hands visible. 2 officers moved in immediately, cuffing the stocky gunman and hauling him to his feet. The lead officer approached Sarah. "You did this?" "Yes, sir. Both of them?" "Yes, sir." He studied her face, his eyes narrowing. "You former military?" Sarah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Yes, sir." "What branch?" "Army, military police." 2 tours. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "I see." Another officer was checking the jittery gunman who was starting to come around, groaning and clutching his head. They cuffed him too. The lead officer, his name tag read Bradshaw, gestured toward the door. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come down to the station and give a statement." "Of course. And—" He paused, glancing around at the faces watching them. "You might want to prepare yourself. This is going to be a big deal." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I just want to go back to work." Bradshaw gave her a sympathetic look. "I don't think that's going to be possible." He was right. By noon, the story was everywhere. It started with the police scanner. Local reporters monitoring for news picked up the call about an armed robbery at Eddie's diner. Suspects in custody, no civilians injured, routine stuff. But then they heard about the waitress, then they heard about the 4 seconds, then they heard she was former Army. The first news van showed up at 1 o'clock. Then another. Then another. Sarah sat in an interview room at the Millbrook police station answering the same questions over and over. Detective Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, was patient but thorough. "Walk me through it again," Chen said. "From the moment they pulled their weapons." Sarah did. Her voice was steady, mechanical. She'd given statements before, after firefights and incidents overseas. This was no different. Except it was because this wasn't supposed to be her life anymore. "And you had training in disarming suspects?" Chen asked. "Yes. Hand-to-hand combat, defensive tactics, close-quarters engagement. Standard MP training, plus additional courses for deployment. When did you leave the service?" 2 years ago. "Honorable discharge?" Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "Yes," Chen noticed but didn't push. "And you've been working at the diner for 6 months?" "Yes. No other employment since discharge?" "No." Chen leaned back in her chair. "Ms. Mitchell, you're a hero. You know that, right? You saved a dozen lives today." Sarah said nothing. "The media is going to want to talk to you. They're already calling. National news, local news, everybody. I don't want to talk to them. I understand, but I don't want any of this." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "I just want to go home." Chen studied her for a long moment. "What are you running from?" Sarah met her eyes. "Nothing. I'm not running." "Then what are you doing in a town like Millbrook working as a waitress? A woman with your skills, your training." "I'm living my life," Sarah said. "Or I was until today." Chen nodded slowly. "All right. You're free to go. But Ms. Mitchell? This isn't going to go away. What you did today, people are going to want to know who you are." Sarah stood. "They already know who I am. I'm a waitress." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true anymore. Outside the station, 3 news cameras were waiting. Reporters shouted questions as Sarah pushed through to her car, a 15-year-old Honda that barely ran. "Ms. Mitchell, how does it feel to be a hero? Can you tell us about your military service?" "Were you scared?" Sarah kept her head down and didn't answer. She got in her car, started the engine, and drove away. She went home to her small apartment on the edge of town. 1 bedroom, second-hand furniture, nothing on the walls. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, not from adrenaline, from memory. 4 seconds. That's all it had taken to disarm the jittery gunman. 4 seconds and 2 years of running from who she used to be had disappeared like smoke. She'd felt it the moment she moved. The training, the muscle memory, the cold precision of violence. It had felt as natural as breathing, and that terrified her. Because in Kandahar during her last deployment, that same precision had cost lives, not enemy lives, civilian lives. Sarah closed her eyes, but the images came anyway. The checkpoint, the vehicle approaching too fast. The split-second decision, the orders she gave. The bullets. The screams. The investigation afterward had cleared her. Rules of engagement, they said. Threat assessment, they said. You did your job, they said. But the father clutching his dead daughter in the dusty road hadn't cared about rules of engagement, and neither had Sarah. She'd finished her tour. She'd come home. She'd tried to disappear, until today. Her phone buzzed. Text messages were pouring in. Numbers she didn't recognize, reporters, strangers. She turned it off. Someone knocked on her door. Sarah froze. The knock came again. Firmer this time? She stood slowly, moved to the door, and looked through the peephole. It was Eddie. She opened the door. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking older than his 67 years. "Can I come in?" Sarah stepped aside. Eddie walked in and looked around the sparse apartment. He didn't comment on it. He just turned to face her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Tell you what?" "Who you were. What you could do." Sarah crossed her arms. "It didn't matter." "Didn't matter?" Eddie's voice rose slightly. "Sarah, I watched you take down 2 armed men like it was nothing. Like you'd done it 1,000 times. "I have," Sarah said. The words hung in the air. Eddie studied her face. "What happened over there?" "I don't want to talk about it." "Well, too bad," Eddie said, his voice gentle but firm. Because I've been watching you for 6 months, Sarah. I've seen you flinch at loud noises. I've seen you scan every room like you're looking for threats. I've seen you keep your back to the wall. I knew something happened. I just didn't know what. Sarah looked away. You should go, Eddie. No, she looked back at him, surprised. No, he repeated. Because you're hurting and you've been hurting alone for too long. And today you saved lives, Sarah. You're a hero. I'm not a hero. Then what are you? Sarah's voice cracked. I'm someone who's made too many mistakes. Eddie stepped forward and put a hand on her shoulder. Then maybe, he said quietly, it's time to start forgiving yourself. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, a dam she'd been holding back for 2 years, and for the first time since Kandahar, she cried. 3 days later, Sarah's face was everywhere. The story had gone viral. Waitress disarms gunman in 4 seconds ran on every major news network. The security camera footage from Eddie's diner had been released by the police. Grainy but clear enough to show the moment Sarah moved, the speed and precision of her actions. People called her a hero, a warrior, an inspiration. Sarah stopped watching the news. She stayed in her apartment, curtains drawn, phone still off. Eddie brought her groceries and sat with her quietly. Not pushing, just being there. On the 4th day, there was a different knock on her door. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw a woman in her 50s wearing a dress uniform, Army. The rank insignia on her shoulders showed a lieutenant. Colonel. Sarah's heart sank. She opened the door. The woman stood at attention and saluted. Sergeant Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, Army Public Affairs. May I come in? Sarah didn't salute back. She wasn't active duty anymore. But old habits died hard and she stepped aside. Hayes entered and waited until Sarah closed the door. At ease, Sergeant. This isn't official business. Not exactly. Then why are you here? Hayes sat down on the couch without being invited. She had the air of someone who'd commanded respect for decades and knew how to use it. Because your story has reached the Pentagon. And because I know what happened in Kandahar. Sarah's blood went cold. I've read your file, Hayes continued. All of it. Including the classified after-action report from Operation Clear Sky. Sarah's hands clenched. Then you know I was cleared. I know you followed protocol, Hayes said. I also know that following protocol doesn't always make it easier to live with. Sarah said nothing. Hayes leaned forward. 3 civilians killed. A father and 2 children. The vehicle failed to stop at your checkpoint. Intelligence indicated a vehicle-borne IED attack was imminent in that sector. You gave the order to fire. Your team followed that order. I know what happened, Sarah said, her voice tight. I was there. And afterward, you found out the father was deaf. He didn't hear your warnings. He was just trying to get his family to safety. Sarah closed her eyes. You did everything right, Sergeant. Hayes said quietly, and it still went wrong. That's war. That's the impossible burden we ask soldiers to carry. I can't carry it anymore, Sarah whispered. I know. That's why you're here. Working in a diner in a town that doesn't know you. That's why you buried who you are. Hayes paused. But what you did 3 days ago? That's who you really are, Sarah, not the mistakes. Not the guilt. The woman who put herself in harm's way to save innocent lives. That's the real you, Sarah opened her eyes. Why are you telling me this? Hayes pulled out a tablet from her bag and turned it on. Because the Army wants to honor you, for your service, for what you did at that diner. She turned the screen toward Sarah. It showed a press release draft. Former Army sergeant to receive commendation for heroic actions. Sarah's jaw tightened. No, Sarah. No, I don't want it. I don't want the attention. I just want to be left alone. Hayes set the tablet down. I told them you'd say that. She smiled slightly. So I'm here to offer you something else instead. What? A way forward, Hayes said. The Army has a veteran outreach program. We're looking for people with your experience to help train the next generation. Not for combat, but for the hard calls, the moral injuries, the aftermath. You could help other soldiers learn to live with the weight. Sarah shook her head. I can't teach anyone anything. Yes, you can. Because you survived. You're still here, still fighting to find peace. That matters, Sarah. I don't want to go back. I'm not asking you to. Hayes stood. I'm asking you to turn your pain into purpose. Think about it. She pulled out a business card and set it on the table. When you're ready, she walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. Those construction workers? The ones who mocked you at the diner? Sarah frowned. What about them? Hayes smiled. They gave interviews. Said they were ashamed of how they treated you. Said they'd never seen anyone braver in their lives. One of them cried on camera. Despite everything, Sarah felt a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, but close. Hayes left. Sarah sat alone in her apartment, staring at the business card, A Way Forward. For 2 years she'd been standing still, trapped between who she was and who she could never be again. But maybe there was something in between. Maybe there was a path she hadn't seen. That evening, Eddie called. Sarah, you need to come to the diner. Eddie, I can't, please. Just trust me. 20 minutes later, Sarah pulled up outside Eddie's diner. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. The bullet hole in the window had been replaced with fresh glass. She walked inside. The diner was full. Every booth, every stool at the counter, all occupied. And everyone turned to look at her as she entered. Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Henderson, the young mothers with their children, the construction workers, including the big one with a bandage on his temple, and dozens of others. People from town, regulars and strangers, they all stood up and they applauded. Sarah froze in the doorway, her throat tight. Eddie walked over, tears in his eyes. They wanted to thank you, he said. All of them. The construction worker stepped forward, his eyes red. Ma'am, his voice cracked. I'm sorry. For what I said. For how I treated you. I was wrong. And you saved my life anyway. Sarah didn't know what to say. Mrs. Calloway came next, taking Sarah's hands in hers. You are a remarkable woman, and this town is blessed to have you. One by one they came to her, shaking her hand, hugging her, thanking her. And Sarah realized something. She'd spent 2 years running from judgment, her own and others. She'd believed that Kandahar defined her, that the mistakes she'd made were all anyone would ever see. But these people didn't see Kandahar. They saw the woman who stood between them and death. They saw courage, sacrifice, strength. They saw a hero. Maybe they were right. Maybe she'd been wrong about herself all along. When the crowd finally settled, Eddie brought out a cake. Chocolate. Her favorite, though she'd never told him. Written in white frosting. Thank you, Sarah. She cut the first slice with shaking hands, and the diner erupted in cheers. Later, as people filtered out and the diner grew quiet, Sarah sat at the counter with Eddie. You going to take that army job? He asked. Sarah was surprised. How did you know about that? Eddie smiled. Small town. Word gets around. He poured her a cup of coffee. For what it's worth, I think you should. I don't know if I can. Sarah, I've been running this diner for 30 years. I've seen a lot of people come through that door. And I can tell you this. The ones who matter aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who keep going afterward. You keep going. That's who you are. Sarah stared into her coffee. What if I fail? Then you fail. And you get back up, just like you always have. Sarah thought about Kandahar, about the father and his children, about the weight she'd carried for 2 years. It would never go away completely. She knew that now, but maybe she could carry it differently. Maybe she could turn it into something that helped others. She pulled out her phone, turned it on for the first time in days, and looked at the business card Lieutenant Colonel. Hayes had left. Then she typed a message. I'm ready to talk. She hit send. Eddie smiled. That's my girl. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. 30 young soldiers sat at desks, fresh-faced and eager, about to deploy for the first time. She'd been invited to speak about moral decision-making in combat, about the weight of leadership, about living with the consequences she'd been terrified to accept. But here she was. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she said, her voice steady, and I'm going to tell you about the hardest decision I ever made. She told them about Kandahar, about the checkpoint, about the vehicle that didn't stop, about the father who couldn't hear. And she told them what came after. The guilt, the isolation, the years of running. I thought that mistake defined me, she said. I thought it was all I'd ever be. But I was wrong. Because 6 months ago I had a chance to make a different choice, and that choice reminded me that we're not defined by our worst moments. We're defined by what we do next. The soldiers listened, some with tears in their eyes. After the class, a young private approached her. "Ma'am, how did you forgive yourself?" Sarah thought about it. "I didn't, not completely. But I learned to live with it. And I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to keep going, to keep trying to be better." The private nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." That night, Sarah called Eddie. "How'd it go?" he asked. "It went well," Sarah said, and she meant it. "You coming back to visit?" "Soon, I promise." "Good. The diner's not the same without you. Although I did hire a new waitress. She's good, but—" he chuckled. "She can't disarm gunmen." Sarah laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. After they hung up, she stood on the balcony of her temporary quarters and looked out at the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, soldiers were training, preparing for war, preparing for impossible choices, and Sarah was here to help them. Not to make it easier, it would never be easy, but to help them survive it, to help them find their way back. She thought about the diner, about the 4 seconds that changed everything, about the construction workers who'd mocked her, then saw her for who she really was, about Mrs. Calloway and Eddie and all the people who'd stood and applauded. They'd given her something precious, a second chance, not to erase the past, but to build something new from it. Sarah Mitchell, former sergeant, former waitress, now instructor and advocate, smiled. She was finally home. Not in a place, but in purpose.